The American voters now, as we know, are divided politically and culturally. They are concerned about where the United States of America is currently headed. As voting is underway across the country, voters' concern is also divided over inflation, abortion, crime, the mounting threat of political violence. Amidst this, the 2022 U.S. midterms are projected to be the most expensive non-presidential election in history. The total cost of the federal and state election is projected to exceed $16.7 billion, according to Open Secrets. The election-related spending at the federal level has already blown past the 2018 midterm record of $7.1 billion. The 2018 midterm generated about $14 billion in spending. Open Secret has added that Senate races generate the most spending. Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin are projected to be the most expensive races in the U.S. The high stakes in this year's races have escalated partisan spite at different levels across the U.S. In addition to becoming more polarized, the United States is at risk of becoming more radicalized, as it's now dangerous for participants at all levels of the election process. Earlier, U.S. security and law enforcement agencies issued a heightened threat advisory. It warned that following the midterms, conspiracies of election fraud could cause violence. Now, according to a poll conducted by ABC News and Washington Post, around 88% of the people are concerned that there is an increased risk of politically motivated violence in the United States. When the voters take part in the polls, we're asked who is more to blame for this risk. 31% blamed the Republican Party, 25% blamed it on the Democrats, and 32% blamed both parties equally. All right, let me go back to Voice of America correspondent Jessica Stone at this point. Jessica, when the Democrats say democracy itself is on the ballot, they are referring to the Republican election deniers, who, if the GOP loses, are likely to say it wasn't a fair election, pretty much on the lines of what happened after the 2020 presidential polls, which Trump lost to Biden. Now, does this seem more like political rhetoric to you, or are there enough reasons to believe that election deniers could in fact trigger chaos and violence in the aftermath of this election? Now, we know what happened on the 6th of January 2021 on Capitol Hill, and let's not forget the brutal attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband that took place on the eve of this election. Is this the most polarized election the U.S. has ever seen?
It certainly is very polarized. In fact, when I went to vote on Friday as an early voter, I asked the poll workers from the Republican side and the Democratic side who were just, giving sample ballots, trying to just encourage people to vote, welcome people to the polls, whether they had actually spoken. And I looked at the Republican and he said, we haven't spoken. And it was a beautiful sunny day. And the Democrats said, no, we haven't spoken. And, these people were sitting and working 2 feet from each other, and they're both Americans. It's a beautiful sunny day. They could have talked about the weather or their grandchildren, but they did not speak. And that's just a small anecdote to underscore how polarized this election has been. I joked with them. I said, there's a lot on the line this year, and they said, yep. So it seems to me that is very much emblematic of what we're dealing with here. We talked about how people are voting in different manners, and that also has to do with the rhetoric about the trust that people have in the election system. But we did get a briefing this morning from the cybersecurity officials in the U.S. government who said, quote, there is no specific or credible threat to election infrastructure. Now, that does not refer to physical threats on polling locations or polling workers, but it does mean that the U.S. government currently has no threats on its radar to the actual computer systems that are running these election systems. Nonetheless, the FBI and other security agencies have asked each state organization, each state party organization to be on guard for hacking from the Chinese government, for lies and influence campaigns, also from the Chinese government as well as from the Russian government, or people just working in those countries on behalf of those governments. Election officials say right now they are most concerned about lies and conspiracy. And this goes back to the election deniers. It goes back to shaking people's very faith in the system, that their vote will be counted. And that's what you're talking about when you're talking about the claims that democracy is on the line. That's what we're talking about here.
Democracy is on the line. This is perhaps the one thing that this election will be most remembered for and by. Famous words, really. by President Biden in the intense campaign ahead of this election. Susan, let me come back to you. What explains the fact that this is the most expensive midterm election in U.S. history, with a projected $16.7 billion being spent on federal and state races? As we pointed out, Senate races, particularly those that are projected to be toss-ups or very close, generate the most spending. Therefore, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada and Wisconsin are projected to be the most expensive races. But does this alone explain the mind-boggling spending?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I think it sort of goes back to how polarized really our politics have become on the one hand, and on the other hand, really the role big money plays in politics with each passing year. We really see that candidates are trying to get voters' attention in various ways, and if at one point, it was only television ads, the way the candidates are focusing on voters' attention has expanded. But I do want to say that while so much money is being spent on the midterm elections, it was very interesting to see how, when you poll, and this doesn't really reflect in the majority of polling, but then when you really dig down into the polls, you see that the majority of Americans really fall somewhere in the middle. They're centrists. They're neither to the extreme of the right or the left. And they're sort of stuck in this sort of vacuum in the middle, and you have these really outlandish ads that are geared towards them, and then you have really large swaths of the population that really can't relate to either candidate on either side. So the majority of Americans aren't really extreme, and they don't have extreme views on a lot of the issues that these monies and these campaigns are spending on. But nonetheless, I think that again, candidates believe that a lot is on the line for them, for their states, and they've decided to go all in. And it was very interesting to see that a lot of Democrats decided to spend a lot of money on Republican so-called MAGA candidates that they thought would be easier to run against in various states. However, that had the opposite effect, and now those MAGA candidates are in some states taking over and winning. So that kind of money was sort of wasted in a lot of ways. So that's a really interesting side note.
Well, certainly another very interesting aspect of this fascinating election. We don't know when the results are going to be out, whether we'll have to wait for 24 hours or 48 hours or 72 hours or a whole week, or who knows, maybe even longer. But we certainly hope that democracy wins and we do not see the kind of chaos that has unfortunately been witnessed in the U.S. before. Whichever way this goes, whether it goes the Democrats' way or the Republicans' way, it has to be said that this is perhaps the most fascinating midterm election that we have seen in the United States in recent years. Thank you so much, Jessica and Susan, for bringing us those updates from New York and Washington, D.C. We'll keep coming back to you for the very latest on this big and developing story.